The Relations of Iran and Japan by Tom Leonard. All throughout our world's history, there have been many stories and circumstances where two people or nations who agreed to see eye to eye broke off from that tie. In today's world, that problem is evident between Iran and Japan. Pictured here are Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and President of Iran Hassan Rouhani. This marked the first visit by an Iranian president in 19 years to Japan, which was in December 2019. Iran is about 4,000 miles away from Japan and is a large, dry, and arid space. Covered by mostly desert, it is rich in natural resources, the most prominent one being oil, which is heavily demanded throughout the world. It has a history of being very strategically grounded and has been admired as a long and respected power in the Middle East. The capital of Iran is Tehran, and it has very impressive architecture and gardens. However, the city is plagued with the troubles of the Iranian Revolution, which damaged most of the city and many landmarks. Iran is also a heavily dominated Muslim country, where a majority of people believe and preach Muslim ideologies. Crude oil is the most famous and most popular resource that Iran exports, and one of its most famous buyers is Japan. Heavily favored 4,000 miles away, Japan over time has grown significantly as a country. After being settled almost 30,000 years ago, Japan has proven time and time again to face their problems and win or learn. All throughout the history of the world, Japan has shown opposition against unwanted or unnecessary war. And today is one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world, with numerous imports being oil, machinery, and food.
A historic visit at a critical time in the Islamic Republic. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe landed at Mehrabad Airport, where he was greeted by Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. Officially, this visit is to mark the 90th anniversary of the two countries' diplomatic relations. And President Hassan Rouhani was on hand at Saadabad Palace in Tehran to greet the Prime Minister. Following a 2.5-hour meeting behind closed doors, the two leaders emerged with strong words.
We are not interested in starting a war with the United States, but if anyone starts a war with us, we will be resolute in our response.
And the Japanese Prime Minister was very clear that his visit was not just to celebrate diplomatic relations.
The reason I am here is to avoid tensions. Iran must play a constructive role in the region. Japan will not give up. I hope today's visit will be a first step in achieving the goal of stability in this region.
Japan has long been an ally of Iran. It bought over $2 billion worth of oil from Tehran last year. But since U.S. sanctions were introduced, it has stopped. And that is why Hassan Rouhani is asking the Japanese Prime Minister to convey the message to the U.S. government that economic war will not help bring Iran to the negotiating table.
The best thing Iran expects from the Japanese Prime Minister is to tell the Americans that what is Iran's expectations for any kind of possible new talks between the two sides.
As a non-signatory to the 2015 nuclear agreement, Japan has a unique vantage point. It is seen as an outside party that could try to de-escalate tensions in this region.
After officially declaring diplomatic relations in 1929, Iran and Japan remained in a very strong, friendly, and strategic partnership throughout the years. The only time it was heavily challenged in the 20th century was in World War II, when the Allies invaded Persia. However, their relations were shortly restored after the war concluded. Going back to the Iranian Revolution, there was a large number of Iranian migrants that fled to Japan, which led to a visa agreement being canceled and terminated. Although in such years since these problems, they relatively remained on the same page, worked strongly together to get things done, both on the business side and diplomacy side.
The post-Iran nuclear deal environment is proving to be a challenge for Japan. Although a close strategic ally of the United States, Tokyo relies heavily on Iranian energy products. Japan has already cut down on imports from Iran by 15% as it braces for an inevitable halt in trade. Japanese officials will be negotiating how to move forward while working with Europe to save the nuclear deal. The stakes are high. Japan would be compelled to stop crude imports from Iran unless Tokyo secures a waiver from the US Treasury. As Washington tightens the screws on Tehran, energy security will be a major cause of concern for Tokyo, threatening to further strain US-Japan relations.
In more recent news, the U.S. has imposed numerous sanctions on Iran's oil. These moves ultimately happened because of Iran's providing of financial support to the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, which is a military unit that the United States is against for its terrorist group activity. These sanctions should create any problems for any future presidents that want to look to Iran for future negotiations about oil. As Japan is allies with the United States, this makes it increasingly difficult for them to get their number one import from Iran, which is oil, and can make it very difficult for them to have a necessary amount in supply and demand. However, Japanese politicians expect a small impact from this decision by the United States. Although Japan has relied on Iran for crude oil supplies, they are actively looking for other options to take into account if the United States does not follow through. In light of receiving a waiver from the United States, Japan has 6 months to figure out what needs to be renewed and what might be their next step. They are actively talking to top oil exporters and are adequately searching the market for new supplies that may not cause any future problems with any other allies.
Countries sanctioned by the U.S. will often test a new administration, and it seems Iran is doing just that. At a time when global oil demand is starting to return from pandemic lockdowns, preliminary estimates suggest that Iran may have shipped anywhere between 500,000 barrels per day to 1.5 million barrels per day of crude oil last month, mostly to China. The truth is probably closer to 1 million barrels per day, and that represents a sharp rise from last year, when U.S. sanctions pushed volumes as low as 500,000 barrels a day. Iran is a member of OPEC, and while it's been exempt from OPEC production cuts because of the sanctions, this unchecked increase in exports causes a problem for other members. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait are some of the countries that benefited from the fall in Iranian oil exports, along with Russia, as they produce a similar type of crude to Iran. Iranian crudes are mainly heavy and medium but high in sulfur, which calls for complex refining. The main buyers of this type of crude are China, India, Japan, and South Korea, only one of which is likely to ignore U.S. sanctions.
In the bigger picture, Iran and Japan over the years have overcome their differences significantly. Whether it was long or short, they have kept diplomatic attitudes and respect between them. They have not come into any physical warfare against each other, although they do have different viewpoints on the nuclear weapons situation. Japan is a major export for Iran, and Iran loves a good economy, and a thriving one as well. Their allies and who they take sides with, not agreeing with each side, makes it all the more difficult. And if this wasn't the case, it is very believable that they would be serious benefactors of each other in all aspects of a strong nation growing that become more closely associated rather than being only business partners.